Hi, my name is Alejandra Quintana, and I'm very glad and honored to be here with you, presenting the paper and doing with one hand what has been done with the other, school dropout and illicit economies during the peace negotiation with the Colombian guerrilla FARC-EP. This is a paper co-authored with Juan, Guillermo, Bedoya, and Fabio, Sánchez. In the past decades, literature has analyzed the consequence of conflict with particular attention on educational outcomes, and finds that in the short run the effects of civil conflict and violence are catastrophic. A large body of literature has documented the negative effects on educational outcomes of children exposure to violence derived from civil conflict. Children and youngsters in conflict-affected areas accumulate less years of education, are less likely to enroll in schools, and are more likely to drop out. But what would happen if there is a de-escalation of conflict? Empirical cross-country evidence suggests that after the war ends, there is a rapid and significant recovery in most outcome losses due to conflict. However, beyond this trend revealed by cross-country evidence, it is hard to conclude how the de-escalation of conflict affects people and households living in conflict-affected areas. We fill this gap by asking ourselves how households in areas affected by conflict violence modify their investment decision in human capital accumulation as a consequence of the de-escalation of conflict. This question is even more puzzling if we have into account that armed combat deeply permeates the productive structure of the territories where it develops, creating or appropriating channels in order to obtain funds that usually come from illegal activities. Civilians living in these areas are exposed to a paradoxical reality. Although they suffer the destruction, death, and fear caused by conflict, they also adapt to it and cope with combat, becoming involved in illegal activities. So what if the areas affected by conflict where the households experience a de-escalation of conflict have illegal resources, how the presence of illegal resources would change the decisions of the households to send their children to school? And what would happen if at the same time that there is a de-escalation of conflict, there is an increase in illicit economies? To answer these questions, we exploit a unique historical setting. We take advantage of the fact that in 2012 the Colombian government and the country's largest guerrilla revolutionary armed forces of Colombia People's Army FARC-EP agreed to start a negotiation in order to end a decade-long civil conflict. The peace dialogue had several developments in the political and developmental realms. However, two developments were critical for our research. First, in December 2012, the FARC-EP declared a ceasefire as a credible sign of commitment. Second, in May 2014, the delegations of the negotiation parties announced that the government would provide monetary incentive for voluntary substitution of coca crops as a way to reduce illegal revenues feeding the conflict. This changed completely the dynamics of the Colombian conflict. The number of total FARC victims attacks over 100 inhabitants was reduced by 90%. However, at the same time that violence is reduced, there is an increase in illicit resources as we can see in these graphs. Coca leaf crops increased from 47,000 to 146,000 hectares between 2012 and 2016. To causally identify the effect of the ceasefire in the most violent territories on dropout rates, we implement a difference-in-difference methodology, as shown in the following equation. Using Civilings microdata, our main specification exploits the unexpected timing of the first unilateral FARC-EP ceasefire announced on December 2012, as well as the geographic variation of the exposure to FARC violence across municipalities prior to these events, and introduces the importance of comparing civilians by introducing households' fixed effects. The effects of ceasefire on school dropout decisions of children and youngsters is the difference-in-difference estimate of the impact of the de-escalation of conflict during the year that the FARC-EP ceased their attacks, controlling by the differential effect of the de-escalation of conflict across siblings of different ages in the same households. The main assumption of our baseline specification is that there would be a common trend across municipalities with different levels of FARC-EP violence in absence of the ceasefire. We address this concern by including the prior years 2010, 11, and 12 in the main specification as shown in the following equation. And these are the results we obtained. It is observed that before the ceasefire before 2013, the coefficients are not statistically significant. This result confirmed the absence of differential dropout trends between civilians from municipalities highly exposed to FARC-EP attacks and those that were not highly exposed relative to the year 2009. So now that we know that our specification holds, I would like to show you our main results. This is a huge table with a lot of robust checks and with heterogeneous effects of the ceasefire on the primary and secondary students, urban households, and rural households. Overall, our estimates suggest that the de-escalation of the Colombian conflict led to an increase in the risk of dropping out of school of students who attend schools in municipalities highly exposed to FARC violence. And these results, I would like you to see that are concentrated in the rural households and on the secondary students. In order to interpret such counterintuitive results, we examine the economic changes that occur in the ceasefire areas. In particular, the de-escalation of peace agreement in Colombia brought about notable growth in coca crops that could have triggered the increase in dropout rates. Such growth, according to Mejia, Prema, and Vargas, was produced by the perversive incentive of the peace agreements that established money would be granted to the peasants that substitute coca for other crops. Also, anecdotal evidence indicates that usually children leave school to work in coca crops. For instance, El Espectador, a national Colombian newspaper, report that in many coca crops areas, children leave school in most cases to harvest coca leaf in their families or neighbors' plantation. Additionally, when asking a peasant in Tumaco, the municipality with the highest areas of coca crops, how many families depend on coca, he replied, I would say that every family in Tumaco depends on a coca crop. So, to test whether the search of coca crops is the driving factor that increased the dropout in the municipalities that experienced the reduction in FARC-EP violence, we introduce into our baseline specification a variable that indicates whether the municipality where the student is attending school is suitable for growing coca or not. So, building from our baseline model, we add the variable coca-m, which is a dummy variable indicating whether the municipality's potential area to grow coca is higher than the country's median. And these are the results that we got. It seems that the change in the marginal return of child labor in coca crops is the driving factor behind the increase in school dropout. And we could see that it's the mechanism that mainly explains why children are dropping out of school in general, but it's the main mechanism that explains why students of rural households are dropping out of schools when there is a de-escalation of conflict. This paper provides evidence that a scenario of de-escalation of armed confrontation is not necessarily accompanied by a progressive improvement in human capital accumulation of the population heavily affected by conflict. Defying the odds, the results obtained reveal that the de-escalation of armed conflict in Colombia has negative impact on school attendance of most vulnerable students living in municipalities historically affected by actions of the FARC-EP. Therefore, this study sheds light to the puzzling reality that civilians living in conflict zones face. especially when illegal activities are present. In a scenarios where the end of the combat is complemented with the presence of resources highly susceptible to illicit exploitation, as coca crops in this case, short-term return in illegal labor markets end up being highly attractive and susceptible, and incentive schools drop out. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope you enjoy our investigation.